Lucas Vance had a passion for the forgotten, not the grand historical relics that drew crowds and filled museum halls, but the quiet, unassuming objects that whispered of lives lived and stories untold. His small antique shop, nestled in the sleepy town of Havenwood, was a testament to this fascination. Dusty trinkets, time-worn furniture, and faded photographs lined the shelves, each piece a silent narrator of a bygone era. Havenwood itself mirrored Lucas's love for the past. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where the rhythm of life echoed a gentler, more nostalgic melody. The townsfolk, a close-knit community, appreciated Lucas's unique perspective, often bringing him forgotten treasures from their attics and basements. One sweltering afternoon, a local handyman, Old Man Withers, mentioned a peculiar shop on the outskirts of town, a place so dilapidated and shrouded in overgrown vines that it seemed to belong to another century. Intrigued, Lucas decided to explore. The shop, tucked away at the end of a winding dirt road, was exactly as described. A relic of a forgotten time. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Objects of all shapes and sizes cluttered the dimly lit space, creating an eerie labyrinth of forgotten memories. As Lucas navigated the maze of discarded treasures, his eyes were drawn to an ornate mirror tucked away in a shadowed corner. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its frame intricately carved with grotesque figures and swirling patterns. The glass, though clouded with age, seemed to hold a strange, hypnotic depth. An inexplicable pull drew Lucas closer, a sense of familiarity mixed with unease. Ignoring the prickling sensation on his skin, Lucas reached out and touched the cool, smooth surface of the frame. A jolt, like static electricity, ran through his fingertips. He felt as if the mirror was looking back at him, acknowledging his presence. The shopkeeper, a gaunt man with eyes like shadowed hollows, emerged from the back room. He eyed Lucas and the mirror, a flicker of unease crossing his features. "That ain't no ordinary mirror, son," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Some things ain't meant to be disturbed." Ignoring the old man's cryptic warning, Lucas felt an overwhelming urge to possess the mirror. He haggled a price, paid in cash, and loaded the heavy mirror into his truck. As he drove back to Havenwood, the image of the mirror in his rearview mirror seemed to shift, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Back in his apartment, Lucas carefully unwrapped the mirror, revealing its full, imposing presence. He positioned it against the far wall of his bedroom, where it reflected the room's warm, inviting ambiance. For a moment, he simply admired its craftsmanship, the intricate carvings, and the way the light danced across its aged surface. As he gazed into the mirror, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly off. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the light, the distortions caused by the old glass. But as he studied his reflection more closely, he began to notice discrepancies. A slight twitch in his left eye that wasn't there before, a subtle curve, to his lips that seemed more like a sneer than a smile. He blinked, trying to clear his head, but the unsettling feeling persisted. It was as if his reflection had a life of its own, a subtle, independent existence. He shook his head, attributing it to his overactive imagination. "It's just an old mirror," he muttered to himself, trying to reassure himself. That night, Lucas had trouble sleeping. He kept waking up to strange sounds, a soft scratching at the foot of his bed, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the walls, a creaking that echoed from within the old mirror itself. Each sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, but together they created an atmosphere of unease that kept him on edge. He glanced at the mirror, its surface reflecting the dim moonlight that filtered through his window. The reflection seemed darker, more shadowed, and he could have sworn he saw a flicker of movement within its depths, as if something was shifting just beyond the glass. His dreams were no less unsettling. He found himself trapped in a maze of mirrors, each one reflecting a distorted version of himself, a twisted caricature of his fears and insecurities. He saw his reflection morph into grotesque figures, their eyes burning with malevolent intent. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. The image of his distorted reflection burned into his mind. In the days that followed, the unsettling occurrences intensified. He would catch glimpses of movement in the mirror's reflection that didn't correspond to his own. Objects would move on their own. A book sliding off a shelf, a picture frame tilting on the wall. He felt a constant oppressive sense of being watched, as if unseen eyes were following his every move. His anxiety spiked, and he began to avoid looking directly into the mirror, though the feeling of it watching him never ceased. Driven by a growing sense of dread, Lucas decided to delve into the history of the mirror. He started with the old shopkeeper, returning to the dilapidated store on the outskirts of Havenwood. The old man, his eyes clouded with a knowing sadness, was reluctant to speak at first, but Lucas's insistent questioning eventually loosened his tongue. The story was fragmented, shrouded in local legends and whispered rumors. The mirror, it seemed, was the work of a reclusive artisan named Elijah Crowell, who had lived in the area in the late 19th century. Crowell was known for his exceptional craftsmanship, but also for his dark, brooding nature. He was said to have possessed a strange fascination with the human soul, believing it to be a tangible entity that could be captured and contained. Crowell's obsession led him to create a series of mirrors, each one imbued with a dark ritual. A process that supposedly allowed him to trap the essence of those who gazed into them. The mirrors were said to reflect not just the physical appearance, but the very soul of the viewer, exposing their deepest fears and darkest desires. The shopkeeper recounted tales of disappearances and mysterious deaths linked to Crowell's mirrors. Those who possessed them were said to have succumbed to madness, their reflections twisting into nightmarish apparitions. The mirrors were shunned, feared, and eventually scattered, their dark history fading into local folklore. Lucas's research took him to the town's historical society, where he pored over old records and newspaper clippings. He found corroborating evidence of Crowell's existence and his unsettling reputation. There were reports of strange occurrences in houses where Crowell's mirrors were known to have been present, accounts of people seeing their reflections move independently, of hearing whispers and seeing shadows that didn't belong. The more Lucas learned, the more he became convinced that the mirror in his apartment was one of Crowell's cursed creations. The subtle discrepancies in his reflection, the unsettling sounds, the feeling of being watched, they all aligned with the stories he had uncovered. The reflections in the mirror grew increasingly vivid and disturbing. He would catch glimpses of other faces peering over his shoulder, their expressions contorted in fear or malice. Sometimes he would see his own reflection morph into a grotesque caricature, its features twisted and distorted, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. He started to see reflections of people he knew, but experiencing horrific events. His friend, the baker, covered in burns and screaming, and his neighbor, the old lady with her eyes missing and blood dripping from the sockets. He began to question his own sanity, wondering if the mirror was driving him mad. He felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that something terrible was about to happen. He knew he had to do something, but he was trapped, caught in the mirror's unsettling grasp. The line between reality and nightmare began to blur. The mirror's influence permeated every aspect of Lucas's life, casting a shadow over his waking hours and twisting his dreams into horrific visions. He found himself increasingly isolated, his friends and neighbors sensing the change in him, the unease that radiated from his presence. The entity within the mirror grew bolder, its manifestations more frequent and aggressive. The subtle whispers escalated into distinct voices, taunting him, mocking him, feeding on his fear. He would catch glimpses of his reflection moving independently, mimicking his actions with a sinister, mocking twist. Sometimes he would see other figures within the reflection, their faces contorted in expressions of terror, their hands reaching out as if pleading for help. The apartment became a stage for the entity's twisted performances. Objects would levitate and move on their own, their shadows dancing and contorting into grotesque shapes. The air grew heavy, thick with a sense of dread, the silence broken only by the entity's whispers and the unnerving creaking of the mirror's frame. Lucas's behavior changed drastically. He became irritable, paranoid, and withdrawn, his once warm and inviting demeanor replaced by a cold, distant shell. He avoided looking directly into the mirror, but he could feel its gaze upon him, a constant, oppressive presence. He became convinced that the entity was trying to break him, to wear him down until he was weak enough to be consumed. One night, the entity's presence reached a fever pitch. The temperature in the apartment plummeted, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the mirror itself. The shadows in the room deepened, stretching and contorting into monstrous shapes. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a chorus of voices, their words a jumbled mix of threats, promises, and taunts. As Lucas stood frozen in terror, his eyes fixed on the mirror, he saw his reflection begin to move. It stepped out of sync with his own movements, its eyes burning with a malevolent glow. Then it extended its hand, reaching out through the glass, its fingers twitching, beckoning. A voice, cold and smooth, echoed through the room, though Lucas couldn't discern its source. "Join us, Lucas," it whispered, its tone laced with a dark allure. "We have so much to show you." The reflection's lips moved, but the sound seemed to come from all around him. Other reflections appeared behind his, all reaching out. The reflection within the mirror spoke again, each word dripping with a venomous promise. "Embrace the darkness, Lucas. Embrace your true self." Lucas, his mind reeling, felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with terror. He knew he was on the verge of losing himself, of becoming another victim of the mirror's dark influence. He had to fight back, to resist the entity's insidious pull. He lunged for the mirror, intending to smash it, to shatter the gateway to the other side. But as his hand reached out, the reflection moved, anticipating his action. It twisted, contorting into a grotesque parody of his own form, its eyes burning with malevolent glee. The room erupted in chaos. The furniture rattled and shook. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and the shadows danced and writhed like living things. The entity unleashed its full power, a torrent of psychic energy that crashed against Lucas's mind, attempting to break his will. Images flashed through his mind, visions of his deepest fears, his darkest memories, his most painful regrets. The entity was probing his psyche, searching for weaknesses, exploiting his vulnerabilities. It whispered promises of power, of knowledge, of release from his fears. But Lucas knew it was all lies, a trap to ensnare his soul. He fought back with every ounce of his being, drawing on a hidden reservoir of strength he didn't know he possessed. He focused his mind, pushing back against the entity's relentless assault, refusing to succumb to its influence. The apartment became a battleground, the air thick with tension, the silence broken by the entity's taunts and Lucas's ragged breaths. He grabbed anything he could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp, a cast-iron skillet, a shard of broken glass. He hurled them at the mirror, but they passed through the reflection as if it were nothing but air. The entity's attacks grew more intense. It sent waves of psychic energy that slammed into Lucas, throwing him against the wall. It conjured illusions, phantoms that materialized from the shadows. their forms shifting and changing, their eyes burning with malice. Lucas felt his strength waning, his resistance faltering. He knew he was on the verge of being overwhelmed, of succumbing to the entity's power. He saw his reflection once more. Now it reached a hand fully through the mirror. "There is no escape. Join us," it said. Then a moment of clarity. He remembered the old legends, the whispers about the nature of the mirrors. It was said that a reflection was more than just an image. It was a connection, a link between the physical world and the spiritual realm. And in this case, a link to the entity itself. Lucas looked to his reflection, and for the first time did not see a copy of himself, but a tether. With a final, desperate surge of energy, Lucas focused his attention on his reflection. He moved towards it, and as the image reached for him, he reached back. This was not him, but a parasitic reflection, a copy used to pull him in. With the shard of glass, he drove it into the reflection, and with that, into the creature itself. The moment the glass shard pierced the reflection, a shockwave rippled through the room. The mirror shuddered, its frame groaning, and the shadows that had been writhing and dancing suddenly froze, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. The entity within the mirror let out a piercing shriek, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. The mirror's surface cracked, spiderwebbing outward from the point of impact, and the reflection shimmered and distorted, its form flickering like a dying flame. The room was plunged into a momentary darkness, a void that seemed to suck all light and sound into its depths. Then with a final violent tremor, the mirror shattered, its fragments scattering across the floor like shards of obsidian. The entity's presence vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence, a void where its oppressive energy had once filled the room. The air was still thick with the residue of fear and dread, but the oppressive weight had lifted, replaced by a chilling emptiness. Lucas stood amidst the wreckage, his body trembling, his mind reeling. He was alive, but he felt changed, marked by the encounter. He looked down at his own reflection in a large shard of the broken mirror, and it seemed normal, but he knew it wasn't. He swept up the fragments of the mirror, carefully placing them in a box, a grim reminder of his ordeal. He knew he couldn't keep them, but he also couldn't bring himself to discard them completely. They were a part of him now, a tangible link to the darkness he had faced. In the days that followed, Lucas tried to return to his normal life, but the experience had left a deep scar. He was haunted by the memories of the entity's presence, the whispers, the visions, the feeling of being watched. He became hyper-aware of his own reflection, scrutinizing every detail, searching for any sign of the entity's lingering influence. His dreams were plagued by nightmares, visions of the mirror, the entity, and the distorted reflections that had haunted his waking hours. He woke up in cold sweats, his heart pounding, his mind filled with terror. He would get up and look in any reflective surface, only to calm himself down with the normal image he saw back. He found himself avoiding reflective surfaces, the polished glass of store windows, the glossy screens of his electronic devices, even the calm surface of a pond. He couldn't bear to see his own reflection, fearing that the entity might still be lurking within, waiting for an opportunity to return. He became a recluse, withdrawing from his friends and neighbors, isolating himself in his apartment. He was afraid to leave, afraid of what he might see, afraid of what might be waiting for him. He became obsessed with the mirror's history, searching for clues, for answers, for a way to ensure that the entity could never return. His sanity was perpetually questioned, even by him. He'd stare at his hands, wondering if they were truly his, or if the reflection took over, even in the smallest of ways. Every smile in a reflection was a potential smirk, every blink a potential wink from the creature. The feeling never truly went away, and he would never look at a reflective surface the same way again. The last thought echoing in his mind, with a growing sense of panic, was that he knew it wasn't truly gone, and that the reflection would be back.